The Vothrek called it a harvest, not a war. Overmaster Sekelvan had personally reviewed the file on the target 3 times, and each time the conclusion had been the same. This was going to be the easiest acquisition of his long and decorated career. The colony-designated threshold sat on a wet, unremarkable world in a system with a dull yellow star, 7th planet counting outward, and it had been settled for barely 40 of the local years. Its population, according to the intercepts, numbered fewer than 300,000. Its orbital defenses consisted of 2 aging weather monitoring platforms that had been retrofitted with a handful of point defense lasers. Its ground militia was volunteer and part-time. There was no fleet. There was no dreadnought. There was, as far as the Vothrek Compact was concerned, nothing there at all except farmland, foundries, and a resource that the Compact's engineers had begun to covet with an intensity that bordered on the religious. The humans had learned to fold metal. Sekelvan understood the technical explanation only in the vague, contemptuous way that a commander understands the work of his subordinates. There was a facility on Threshold, sunk into the flank of a mountain range the colonists called the Ironbacks, where the humans took raw ore and did something to it that no compact metallurgist had been able to reproduce. Some process of layering and hammering and folding, a thing they had apparently carried with them across the void from their homeworld, refined and refined until it became a science with the soul of an art. The product was a class of structural alloy that the Compact's own laboratories could not match, could not even properly analyze. Ships built with the human folded plate held together under stresses that turned compact hulls to shrapnel. The humans called the facility the Star Forge, and they were absurdly, insufferably proud of it. Sekelvan intended to take it intact. He intended to take the engineers who ran it intact. He intended, in the fullness of time, to deliver to the Compact Assembly a working forge, a compliant workforce, and the personal satisfaction of having done it with a single expeditionary flotilla against a colony that could not muster a real navy to save its own soil. Contempt, he would later reflect, much later, in the long silence after everything had come apart, was the most expensive luxury a soldier could carry into a fight. But that was later. Now, in the cold blue light of the flagship Ascendant Toll's command well, Sekelvan looked down at the tactical projection of Threshold turning slowly beneath his flotilla, and felt only the pleasant anticipation of a task well begun. "Deployment status," he said. His flag captain, a lean and eager officer named Toresk, answered without looking up from his console. "All 14 landing barges are loaded, Overmaster. Ground element is 9,000 troops with armor support. Orbital element holds station. The colony's 2 platforms have gone active, but they are firing on our screening frigates with no effect. We estimate the platforms will be neutralized within the hour." "And the colony's transmissions?" "They are broadcasting a surrender demand to us." Toresk's mouthparts clicked in something like amusement. "Not a surrender offer, Overmaster, a surrender demand. They are ordering us to withdraw from their system within 12 of their hours or face, and I quote the translation, the full consequences of Threshold's defense." A low ripple of laughter moved through the command well. Sekelvan permitted himself to share in it. 300,000 farmers on a mudball with 2 dying satellites and a militia of weekend soldiers, and they were issuing ultimatums to a compact flotilla. It was almost endearing. It spoke to a certain provincial courage, the kind of thing that made for a good story once the shooting was over and the survivors had been resettled and put to useful work. "Record their demand," he said. "The assembly will enjoy it. Now silence their platforms and put my troops on the ground. I want the Starforge facility cordoned before the humans have time to sabotage it. Emphasize to the ground commanders, the forge is to be taken whole. Anyone who damages that facility will answer to me personally." "By your word, Overmaster." The order went out, And on the surface of Threshold, in a valley cupped between two arms of the Ironback Mountains, a 19-year-old woman named Cass Delgado stood on the observation catwalk above the Starforge's main pour floor and watched the sky begin to burn. Cass had been born on Threshold. She had never seen the homeworld her grandparents talked about, the crowded blue earth with its oceans and its history and its terrible, glorious weight of years. She had been born here, in the third pressurized habring of the original landing settlement, and she had grown up with the smell of hot metal in her lungs and the sound of the forge hammers in her bones. Her mother ran the number 2 annealing line. Her father had died when she was 11, caught in a coolant rupture that the whole colony still spoke of in the hushed way people spoke of the Ironbacks in winter. Cass had been apprenticed to the forge at 14, which was young even by Threshold standards, because she had a gift for the work that the master smiths could not ignore. She could feel a bad fold before it happened. She could put her palm flat against a cooling billet and know, the way some people know rain is coming, whether the layers had married true or whether there was a flaw sleeping in the heart of the steel. The old smiths called it having good hands. Master Okonkwo, who had run the pour floor since before Cass was born, called it something else. He called it listening. The steel is always talking, he had told her the first week of her apprenticeship, his voice a low rumble under the roar of the furnaces. Most people are too loud inside to hear it. You are quiet in the right way. That is a rare thing, girl. Don't waste it. She had not wasted it. In 5 years, she had risen from apprentice to journeysmith to shift lead on the experimental line, the line where they tried the new folds, the deep layerings that gave the Starforge alloy its impossible strength. She was the youngest shift lead in the facility's history, and she had learned to carry the weight of that without letting it make her arrogant, because arrogance at a forge got people killed, and she had already lost one parent to a moment's inattention. She was 19 years old, and she loved the work more than she had words for, and she was standing on the catwalk with a cooling billet's data still glowing on her wrist slate, when the first Vothrek plasma lance came down through the atmosphere and struck the eastern ridge like the fist of an angry god. The concussion reached the forge 4 seconds later. The whole mountain shuddered. Down on the pour floor, a crucible car jumped its rails and a river of molten steel slopped across the containment channel, and someone screamed, and the emergency klaxons began their slow, sick wail. Cass did not scream. She did not run. She had been trained since childhood in what to do when the mountain moved. Threshold sat on an active fault, and forge quakes were a fact of life, and her body executed the drill before her mind had finished understanding what was happening. She hit the catwalk's emergency channel with the heel of her hand. Pour floor, this is Delgado. Seal the crucible car and clear the channel. We have a slot breach on line 4. Get everyone back behind the yellow line, move. Her voice cut through the chaos. People moved. That was the first thing the Vothrek never understood about the humans, though it would take them a long and terrible campaign to begin to grasp it, that a human packed with fear will still, if trained and if led, do the correct thing with her hands while her heart is trying to climb out of her throat. The klaxons changed pitch. That was not the forge quake alarm. Cass looked up, and through the great open ventilation arch at the top of the pour floor, the arch that let the furnace heat bleed off into the mountain sky, she saw the streaks coming down. A dozen of them. 2 dozen. Falling stars that did not burn out, that grew larger and larger until she could see they were shaped, that they were ships, that they were landing barges the size of city blocks descending on columns of blue fire toward the valley floor. Cass, a hand closed on her shoulder. It was Rena, the line 2 lead, her friend since childhood, her face gone the color of cold ash. Cass, that's not a quake. That's the militia net just lit up. They're saying it's an invasion. They're saying it's the compact. Cass looked at the descending barges and felt something in her chest go very still and very cold. Not fear, exactly. Something older than fear. Something that lived in the human animal underneath fear, in the place where fear turns into resolve if you have the wiring for it. She had heard the older colonists talk about the compact the way her grandmother had talked about Earth's old wars, as a thing that happened to other people, far away, a shadow at the edge of the map. Now the shadow was landing in her valley. "How long until they reach the forge?" she asked. Rena shook her head helplessly. "I don't minutes. The militia's mustering at the valley mouth, but there's only 200 of them, and they've got, Cass, they've got hunting rifles and mining charges. That's it. That's what we have." Cass looked down at the poor floor, at the furnaces, at the great folded plate presses that could bring down 40,000 tons of force in a single stroke, at the racks of finished alloy waiting for shipment, at the deep vaults where the master patterns were kept, the accumulated knowledge of the Star Forge, the thing the compact had come to steal. She thought about the coolant rupture that had killed her father. She thought about Master Okonkwo saying the steel is always talking. She thought, absurdly, about how the invaders did not know this place, did not know the mountain, did not know what a forge could do when it stopped being a tool and started being a weapon. "Where is Okonkwo?" she said. "Vault level." He went down to secure the master patterns when the first strike hit. "Get everyone off the poor floor. Non-combatants to the deep shelters through the coolant tunnels, not the main road. The main road is where they'll come. Anyone who can fight, anyone who knows the mountain, tell them to muster at the number 3 furnace gallery. And Rena," Cass caught her friend's arm as she turned to go, "find me every mining charge in this facility. Everyone. And find me Okonkwo. We're not letting them have the forge." Rena stared at her. "Cass, we're smiths, we're not soldiers." "No," Cass said, and later she would not remember deciding to say it, would not remember where the certainty came from, only that it arrived whole and unshakable in the moment she needed it. "We're better than soldiers. We know the ground, now go." The first Vothrek boots touched threshold soil 11 minutes later, and the men and women who wore them were, by any reasonable standard, professionals. The ground element of Sekelvan's flotilla was drawn from the Compact's 9th Expeditionary Legion, a formation with 2 centuries of subjugation campaigns behind it and a reputation for methodical, remorseless efficiency. They had reduced 100 worlds. They had broken the defenses of species far more technologically advanced than the humans of Threshold. They deployed from their barges in disciplined ranks, armored and armed with plasma repeaters and coil lances, screened by walking weapons platforms that stood 4 times the height of a human, and moved on 6 articulated legs with a horrible fluid grace. The Vothrek ground commander, a battle leader named Vothrek, surveyed the valley through his helmet optics and saw exactly what the intelligence file had promised him. A soft target, a cluster of habitation domes, a sprawl of industrial structures at the base of the mountains, a facility gate wide enough to drive a barge through, and there, mustering at the valley mouth in a ragged line, the colony's pathetic excuse for a defense. 200 figures in mismatched gear, some of them holding weapons that Votrek's optics could not even identify because they were not military weapons at all. Hunting implements, tools. Votrek almost pitied them, almost. "Advance to the facility gate," he ordered. "Do not fire on the forge structures. Suppress the defenders at the valley mouth and push through. The Overmaster wants this finished before the local night." The 9th Legion advanced, and the 200 colonists at the valley mouth, who could not possibly hope to stop them, did something that Votrek's 2 centuries of experience had not prepared him for. They did not break. They did not flee. They did not, as a soft target invariably did when the walking weapons platforms came into view, dissolve into a screaming rout. Instead, as the first rank of Vothrek armor advanced into the narrow throat of the valley, the only ground approach to the forge, hemmed on both sides by the sheer stone shoulders of the ironbacks, the colonists set off the mountain. The charges had been placed decades ago, not for war, for avalanche control, Threshold's founders had rigged the valley's upper slopes with seismic charges so that they could bring down the winter snowpack in controlled slides before it built up enough to bury the settlement on its own. Every colonist knew the charge grid existed. Every colonist knew in the abstract that the mountain above the valley mouth was wired to fall. The militia captain, an aging surveyor named Bright who had spent 30 years mapping those slopes, pushed the detonator with a steady hand and brought 4 million tons of the Ironback Mountains down into the throat of the valley on top of the Vothrek, 9th Legion's leading column. The sound of it reached the Starforge as a single vast tearing roar that went on and on. Cass, standing in the No. 3 furnace gallery with a mining charge in each hand and 40 frightened smiths looking to her for what to do next, felt the floor buck under her feet and understood, without being told, what had just happened at the valley mouth. They dropped the north slope, she breathed. And in the command well of the ascendant toll, high above the burning valley, Overmaster Sekil Von watched his tactical projection lose 140 legionnaires and 6 walking weapons platforms in the space of a single heartbeat, buried under a mountain that the humans had, apparently, been prepared to drop on anyone who came for their forge. For the first time in a very long time, the Overmaster stopped smiling. Sekil Von did not panic. That was not in his nature, and it was not, whatever his later critics in the assembly would claim, the reason the campaign turned against him. 140 legionnaires was a painful loss but not a crippling one. He still had the better part of 9,000 troops, still had orbital supremacy, still had the flotilla's guns. What had changed was not the arithmetic of the thing. What had changed was the picture in his mind. He had come to take a prize. He was beginning to understand that he had come to fight a war. "Reassess the ground situation," he said, and his voice in the command well was flat and hard where an hour ago it had been indulgent. "I want to know how they placed those charges, how many more they have, and why our orbital survey did not flag a wired mountainside as a defensive asset." Toresk's answer when it came was not comforting. "Overmaster, the charges appear to be civilian avalanche control infrastructure. It was in the survey. It was flagged as—" the flag captain hesitated. "It was flagged as non-military." The analysis assumed the colonists would not use their own avalanche system as a weapon, because doing so has buried a significant portion of their only ground approach under permanent rubble. They have denied us the valley road, but they have also denied it to themselves. It is he searched for the word. "It is a decision without a retreat, Overmaster. They have committed to a defense they cannot undo." Sekil Von absorbed this. In the long annals of compact subjugation, an enemy that burned its own bridges was a familiar thing, but usually it was the act of a fanatic leadership coercing a terrified population, a last spasm of a doomed regime. What his intelligence told him about Threshold did not fit that pattern. There was no dictator here. There was no ideology, no death cult, no charismatic warlord. There was a colony of farmers and metalworkers who had, faced with an invader, calmly and collectively decided to bury the road home and fight in the ruins. That was not fanaticism. Sekil Von had faced fanaticism many times. Fanaticism was loud, and it was brittle, and it broke the moment its prophets were killed. This was something quieter and far more dangerous. This was a people who had simply, unanimously, without needing to be told, concluded that the forge would not be taken while any of them still breathed. "Versk," he signaled the ground commander directly. "The valley road is closed. Find another way into that facility. There is a ventilation arch at the top of the poor floor. The mountain is riddled with coolant tunnels and mine galleries. I want the forge cordoned by every route the colonists did not think to block. And Versk," a pause. "Their willingness to fight was underestimated. Adjust your expectations. These are not the soft creatures the file described." "Understood, Overmaster." But there was something in Versk's tone, a residue of the old contempt, the professional soldier's disdain for amateurs who had gotten lucky with a rockfall, that told Sekovan the ground commander had not truly heard him. He would. The coolant tunnels were where Cass had grown up. Not literally. She had grown up in the Habrings, in the cramped, warm domesticity of a forge worker's family. But the tunnels were where she had spent her free hours since she was old enough to slip away from her mother's watch. Every apprentice knew the official tunnels, the maintained galleries where the coolant lines ran from the deep aquifer up to the furnaces. But Cass knew the others, the abandoned exploratory bores from the mountain's first survey. The natural fissures the miners had broken into and sealed off as worthless. The crawl spaces above the poor floor where the heat-scavenging ducts ran, hot enough to blister an unprotected hand, but wide enough for a slim body to move through unseen. She knew the mountain the way the Vothrek would never know it, because she had not learned it from a survey. She had learned it with her hands, in the dark, the way she had learned everything that mattered. Master Okonkwo found her in the number 3 gallery an hour after the north slope came down. He was a broad, gray-bearded man who moved slowly and spoke slowly, and had, in 40 years at the forge, never once been seen to hurry. He did not hurry now. He came up the gallery steps with a heavy tread and looked at the 40 smiths gathered there, at the mining charges laid out on a workbench, at the young woman who had gathered them, and he said, "So, you have decided to hold the forge." "They came to take it," Cass said. "Someone has to hold it." Okonkwo lowered himself onto a bench with a grunt. "And you think 40 smiths and a box of avalanche charges can hold a forge against 9,000 soldiers who came down from the sky?" "No," Cass said. "I think 40 smiths who know this mountain can make 9,000 soldiers who don't know it wish they'd never come. There's a difference." The old man looked at her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. A slow, sad, proud smile. The smile of a teacher watching a student pick up a tool she was never formally taught to use and wield it correctly on the first try. "Your father would have said the same thing," he said, in the same words near enough. He heaved himself back to his feet. "All right, shift lead, you've mustered them. Now what do you mean to do with them? Because standing in a gallery holding charges is not a plan. It's a way to die in a gallery holding charges." And that was the moment. Cass would remember it for the rest of her life. That Master Okonkwo, who had run the poor floor since before she was born, who could have taken command with a single word and no one would have questioned him, chose instead to hand the command to her. He did not take the charges out of her hands. He did not say, "Leave this to the older ones now, girl." He looked at her, and he asked her what her plan was, because he had seen something in the way she carried the fear on the catwalk, and he had decided that the mountain would be better defended by her nerve than by his experience. Cass took a breath. She looked at the map of the mountain that lived behind her eyes, the map she had built crawling through the dark for years, and she began, for the first time, to see the forge not as a place of work but as a battlefield. "They can't come up the valley road," she said. "We buried it, so they'll come the other ways, the main gate, the ventilation arch, the maintained coolant galleries, the ones on the survey. Those are the routes their maps will show them, so those are the routes we let them take." "Let them," Okonkwo repeated. "The maintained galleries funnel," Cass said. "That's how they were built, wide at the mountain face, narrow at the furnace end, so the coolant pressure stays up. A soldier coming up a maintained gallery has stone on both sides and no room to spread out. And every one of those galleries runs past a heat-scavenging duct, and every duct connects to the crawlspaces, and the crawlspaces are where I grew up." She looked around at the smiths. "We don't fight them in the open. We can't. We fight them in the throat of the mountain, where their armor and their walking guns can't help them, where we can hit them from the ducts and be gone into the crawlspaces before they can turn around. We bleed them in the dark. And every time they push into a gallery, we make the mountain fall on them again. Not the whole slope. We've only got the one avalanche grid, but the galleries themselves. They're old. The ceilings are shored with timber and steel that we put in, and we know exactly where the props are. We drop the galleries on them one at a time, and we make them pay for every meter of stone." The smiths were very quiet. "And the forge itself?" Okonkwo asked softly. "The poor floor, the vaults, the patterns." "They want it whole." Cass's jaw tightened. "That's their weakness. They didn't come to destroy the forge, they came to steal it. So they can't just bomb the mountain flat and dig us out of the rubble. They'd lose the thing they came for. Every advantage they have, all that orbital firepower, they can't use it here because using it breaks the prize. They have to come in on foot. They have to come into our house. And in our house," she picked up a mining charge, turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of it the way she felt the weight of a cooling billet. "We know where every board creaks." Okonkwo was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, and Cass saw in his eyes that she had passed some test she had not known she was taking. "Assign the galleries," he said. "You know the mountain better than I do. I'll take the vault level and the poor floor. If it comes to the last stand, it comes there, and I want to be standing on the floor I've poured for 40 years. He put a heavy hand on her shoulder, and his voice dropped so that only she could hear it. "One thing, Cass. When it starts, and it will start soon, there is going to be a moment when the fear tries to take your hands. It comes for everyone. It came for me once on a floor a long way from here. When it comes for you, you do what you do with the steel. You get quiet in the right way. You listen. And you let your hands do what they already know how to do. Understand?" "I understand," Cass said. She did not quite, not yet, but she would. Vothrek sent his soldiers into the mountain that evening, and the mountain ate them. He did it correctly, by the book, by 2 centuries of doctrine. He sent probing elements up the 3 maintained coolant galleries and a 4th column through the ventilation arch, with the walking weapons platforms held in reserve at the mountain face because the galleries were too narrow to admit them, a fact that should have warned him, and did not. His soldiers advanced in disciplined fire teams, optics active, sensors sweeping, exactly as they had advanced up the corridors of 100 conquered worlds. The first fire team to reach the narrowing of the western gallery died without ever seeing what killed them. A heat-scavenging duct ran across the gallery, sealing 12 meters back from the narrowing, and in the mouth of that duct, invisible in the shimmer of hot air, a 19-year-old smith named Cass Delgado lay flat on her belly with a mining charge and a length of det cord, and waited until the whole fire team was under the shored section of ceiling she had chosen 3 hours before. Then she blew the props. The gallery came down. 40 tons of ceiling stone dropped 6 meters onto the Vothrek fire team, and the sound of it was swallowed almost entirely by the mountain, so that the fire team behind them heard only a muffled crump and felt the floor shiver, and then found the gallery ahead of them blocked by a wall of rubble that had not been there a moment before, with no sign of what had brought it down, and no sign of the 6 soldiers who had been walking point. Cass was already gone, wriggling backward through the duct into the crawlspace, her heart slamming against her ribs, the fear exactly as Okonkwo had promised it would be, huge and cold and trying to close her throat. She got quiet in the right way. She listened. She let her hands, scraped and shaking, do what they already knew how to do, which was to move through the dark of the mountain toward the next shored section, the next duct, the next fire team that would come up the gallery to find out what had happened to the last one. Across the mountain in the other galleries, the other smiths were doing the same. Rena in the eastern gallery, a pair of furnistenders named Osai and Vance in the central, old Okonkwo's chosen crew holding the ventilation arch, where the drop was longer and the fighting closer, and where, before the local night was over, 3 of the 40 would die holding a duct against a Vothrek fire team that came up faster than expected and cost the smiths dearly before the ceiling came down on them too. By local midnight, Vothrek had lost 60 more soldiers in the galleries and had gained perhaps 200 meters of blocked, impassable tunnel that led nowhere. He had not seen the enemy. Not once. His soldiers reported ghosts, shapes in the heat shimmer, movement in the ceiling ducts, the mountain itself seeming to reach down and swallow his fire teams whole. His optics could not penetrate the crawlspaces. His sensors, tuned for the battlefields of open worlds, were blind and deaf in the hot stone maze of the human forge. He reported to the Ascendant Toll that the facility's interior was actively contested by an unlocated irregular force employing structural demolition, which was the Compact military's careful, doctrinal way of saying that farmers were dropping the mountain on his soldiers, and he could not find them to stop it. And Overmaster Van, reading that report in the cold blue light of his command well, felt the first genuine unease he had known in 40 years of war begin to uncoil in his chest. The unease had a shape, and the shape was a question Van could not stop asking himself. How long? Not how long until the forge fell. He was too experienced to lie to himself about that. The forge would not fall on the first night, or the second, or perhaps the 10th. The question that gnawed at him in the dark hours of the ship's cycle was subtler and worse. How long would his soldiers keep going into a mountain that killed them without letting itself be seen? How long before the 9th Legion, a formation that had never in 2 centuries met an enemy it could not find, began to feel the particular corrosion that eats an army from the inside when it fights ghosts? He knew the answer because he was a good commander, and a good commander knows his own troops better than he knows the enemy. The answer was, not as long as the humans could hold. That was the thing the file had never captured, the thing that no orbital survey could measure. The humans of Threshold did not need to win. They only needed to endure, to make the taking of the forge cost more, and take longer, and grind harder than the Compact was prepared to bear. And Van was beginning to suspect, in the cold place behind his contempt, that the humans were prepared to endure a great deal more than his legion was prepared to spend. On the 4th day, he went down to the surface himself. It was not doctrine. An Overmaster did not walk the ground of an unsecured battlefield. He directed from the flagship, where his mind was clear and his person was safe. But Van had reached the point in the campaign where the reports were no longer telling him what he needed to know, and he had learned long ago that when the reports go strange, a commander must go and see with his own eyes. He landed at the mountain face with an armored escort and stood at the mouth of the western coolant gallery, the one the humans had collapsed on the first night, and he looked into the dark. Vothrek met him there. The ground commander had aged 4 days into something that looked like 4 years. His armor was scarred. There was a new caution in the way he held himself, the caution of a soldier who has learned that the ceiling can come down at any moment and has stopped believing in the map. "Report," Van said. "The truth of it, Vothrek, not the doctrine." Vothrek was silent for a moment, gathering the truth into words. "We have lost 311 soldiers, Overmaster. We have taken perhaps a fifth of the tunnel network, all of it blocked or booby-trapped, none of it leading to the poor floor. We have not captured a single defender. We have not, to my certain knowledge, killed more than a dozen of them, and those only because they held a position too long to cover the escape of the others." He looked into the dark of the gallery. "They fight like the mountain, Overmaster. They give us nothing to hit. They let us walk into the stone and then they close it behind us." And he stopped. "Say it." "My soldiers have begun to fear the tunnels." Vothrek's voice was low with the shame of it. "Not fear as a soldier fears a strong enemy. That we know how to carry. This is different. They fear the dark itself. They fear the shored ceilings. Yesterday a fire team refused to advance up the central gallery until they had shot out every timber prop in sight, and it took them a full hour to advance 40 meters, and at the end of it the humans dropped an unshored section of natural rock on them that no prop could have warned them of. 6 dead. And the survivors came out saying the mountain is alive, Overmaster. They are beginning to believe the mountain itself is fighting them." Van looked into the gallery for a long time. "It is not the mountain," he said at last. "It is worse than the mountain. A mountain does not choose. A mountain does not learn. Somewhere in that stone there is a mind directing this, and it is a mind that has taken our doctrine and turned it into a weapon against us. Every advantage we brought, our optics, our sensors, our armor, our numbers, it has found the ground where none of them matter, and it has drawn us onto that ground and killed us there in the dark. He turned to Vothrek. Find me that mind, Vothrek. Find me the human who is doing this, because we will not take the forge by breaking the mountain. We will take it by breaking the will that holds the mountain against us. It was, in its way, the correct assessment. It was also the beginning of Sekelvan's undoing, because it caused him to do the one thing that a commander facing the humans of Threshold could not afford to do. It caused him to make the fight personal. And a personal fight against a people defending their home is a fight in which the invader is always spending more of himself than the defender. Cass had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in 4 days. She had learned things in those 4 days that she would carry for the rest of her life. She had learned that a human being can be terrified and effective at the same time, that the fear does not have to go away for the hands to work. It only has to be held in the right place, quiet, listened to, like the flaw sleeping in the heart of a billet. She had learned that leadership was not the absence of doubt, but the discipline of not letting the doubt reach the people who were watching you. She had learned that she could send people she loved into the dark to fight, and that some of them would not come back, and that she would have to keep sending them anyway, and that the weight of it would not crush her only if she refused to set it down. Osai had not come back on the second night. Vance had brought his body out through the crawl spaces, and Cass had stood over it in the number 3 gallery with her face perfectly still, while something inside her broke and did not mend. And then she had turned to the next smith waiting for orders and told them where to place their charges, because that was what the work required, and the work did not stop for grief. Okonkwo found her that 4th night in the crawl space above the poor floor, wedged into the hot dark where she had gone to be alone for a few stolen minutes. She did not hear him come. He moved more quietly than a man his size had any right to, and when his voice came out of the dark beside her, she flinched hard enough to crack her head on the duct. "Easy," he said. "It's only me. You shouldn't be up here. The ducts aren't shored for your weight. Neither are you, and you're up here." She heard him settle against the stone, the slow, careful movements of an old man in a young person's space. For a while they said nothing. Below them, through the grating, the banked furnaces of the poor floor glowed a deep sullen red, kept alive on minimum power, waiting. The forge had not poured steel in 4 days. It had been doing other work. "They're getting closer," Cass said finally, "to the poor floor. I can hear them in the maintained galleries further up every day. We've dropped 9 sections on them. We've only got so much gallery left to drop, and the charges are running low." She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. "I don't know how much longer we can do this, Master. I keep doing the arithmetic, us against them, and the arithmetic doesn't work. It never worked. They have 9,000 and we have 34 now. We lost Osai and the 3 at the arch, and the arithmetic says we lose." "Yes," Okonkwo said, "the arithmetic says we lose." "Then why are we still fighting?" The old man was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you remember when you were an apprentice, the first time you felt a bad fold before it happened? You put your hand on the billet and you knew there was a flaw in it, a thing that wasn't there yet but was going to be, and you couldn't have proved it to anyone, and old Kessler laughed at you and poured it anyway, and the billet cracked exactly where you said it would." "I remember. The arithmetic said that billet was sound, girl. Every instrument we had said it was sound, and you knew it wasn't because you were listening to something the arithmetic couldn't measure." Okonkwo's voice was low and even. "The compact does its arithmetic too, 9,000 against 34. They look at that number and they think they know how this ends. But there is a flaw in their billet, Cass, and it is a flaw they cannot measure, and it is us. We are the thing the arithmetic can't count. Every day we hold, we are teaching them that their number is a lie, and a soldier who has learned that the arithmetic is a lie is a soldier who has already begun to lose whatever the arithmetic says." He put a hand on her shoulder in the dark. "We are not fighting to win the arithmetic. We are fighting to break the thing behind it, their certainty, their contempt. The comfortable lie they came here believing, that we were soft and few and would fold. Every hour we don't fold, we crack that billet a little more. And when it goes, and it will go, Cass, I have felt it going for 2 days now. It will go all at once, the way a bad billet goes from the flaw outward, all at once and all the way through." Cass was silent, absorbing this. Below them the furnaces glowed. Somewhere up in the maintained galleries, faint through the stone, came the sound of Vothrek soldiers advancing, meter by grinding meter, into a mountain that had taught them to be afraid. "There's something else," she said slowly. "Something I've been thinking about, the poor floor, the presses." "Go on." "They want the forge whole. That's why they can't bomb us. But it's also why they have to come onto the poor floor eventually. They have to take it intact. They have to walk their soldiers across that floor and secure the presses and the vaults with their own hands. And the poor floor," Cass turned to look at him in the dark, and there was something new in her voice, something that was not the arithmetic and was not despair, something that Okonkwo had been waiting 4 days to hear. "The poor floor is ours, master. Every crucible, every press. Every meter of that channel is rigged to move 40,000 tons of steel and 40,000 degrees of heat, and it all answers to the control gallery, and the control gallery answers to us. If they come onto the poor floor—" "Then we pour the floor," Okonkwo said softly. "Then we pour the floor." The old man began, very quietly, to laugh. It was not a happy sound, and it was not an unhappy one. It was the sound of a smith who has just felt, under his palm, the exact place where the steel is going to break, and knows that it will break where he needs it to. "Your father," he said, "would be so proud of you it would break his heart. Come. If we are going to pour the floor, we have a great deal of very careful work to do, and not much night left to do it in." Sekelvan made his decision on the 7th day, and it was the decision of a commander who had run out of patience faster than he had run out of soldiers. Which is to say, it was the decision of a man who had let the humans get inside his head. He would take the poor floor by direct assault. He knew the cost would be high. He knew the maintained galleries were death, and he knew the humans were waiting for him on the floor, and he knew, Vothrek had told him, in words that carried the weight of 7 days of grinding loss, that the Legion's nerve was fraying. But he also knew that the campaign could not go on this way. Every day it continued was a day the Compact Assembly asked why a single colony was consuming a full expeditionary flotilla. Every day was a day the story spread. And it was spreading, he could feel it. The story of the mudball colony that would not fall, that had buried a mountain on the 9th Legion and vanished into the stone. If Threshold held long enough, it would stop being a colony and become a legend. And legends were far more dangerous to the Compact than colonies, because legends spread to other worlds and other worlds got ideas. He had to end it, now whatever it cost. So on the 7th day, Overmaster Sekelvan committed the reserve. He brought the walking weapons platforms up to the mountain face and cut them a road, blasting the western gallery wide enough to admit them, accepting the collapse of the prize-preserving caution that had bound his hands, because the poor floor itself, the presses, the vaults, would be spared even if the galleries were not. He massed 2,000 soldiers behind the platforms. And at dawn on the 7th day, he sent them up the widened western gallery in a single overwhelming column, the walking guns leading, the soldiers packed behind, driving for the poor floor with everything the 9th Legion had left, to break the human defense in one stroke and take the forge before the legend could grow another day. Cass watched them come on the control gallery's flickering monitors, and she felt the fear rise up huge and cold, and tried to close her throat, and she got quiet in the right way, and she listened, and she put her hand flat on the master pour control the way she would put it on a cooling billet. "Let them get all the way in," she said to the smiths around her, "all the way onto the floor, every last one. We only get to do this once. and she waited, 19 years old, for the enemy to walk into the heart of the forge. In the days between the burying of the valley road and the assault on the poor floor, there were smaller battles that never appeared in any log, compact or human, and it was in those small battles that the campaign was truly decided. There was the matter of the water. On the third day, Vothrek's engineers found the coolant intake where the deep aquifer fed the forge, and they understood correctly that if they fouled the water they could shut down the furnaces from outside without ever setting foot on the poor floor. It was a good plan. It was doctrine. They brought up a chemical charge and prepared to poison the aquifer, and they would have succeeded, because the intake was outside the mountain, beyond the reach of the crawlspaces, in the open valley where the humans could not fight. But the humans did not fight there. They had thought about the water on the first night. Cass had walked the aquifer feed with Okonkwo in her mind's map of the mountain, and she had understood at once that it was the forge's throat, and that a throat was the first thing an enemy would go for. So on the second night, before Vothrek's engineers ever found the intake, a furnace tender named Petra and 2 others had gone out through a crawlspace vent under cover of dark and rigged the intake housing to collapse inward on itself, not to destroy the water, but to bury the intake under 30 tons of its own shielding, sealed and unreachable, so that when the Vothrek engineers arrived with their chemical charge, they found only a slope of rubble where the throat had been, and a forge that had already switched, hours before, to its emergency reservoir. The humans had cut their own water supply to a trickle rather than let the enemy poison it. It was the same logic as the buried road, the same logic as the burned furnaces. Give up the thing, keep the fight. Petra did not come back from the intake. A Vothrek patrol caught her crew in the open on their way back to the vent, and there was a short fight in the dark under the stars, and only one of the 3 returned, and she would not speak of it for a long time. But the water held. The forge kept its throat. And Vothrik lost another day and another good plan to a people who seemed to have thought of everything first, who seemed to be one move ahead of his doctrine at every turn, as if they had war-gamed the taking of their own home 100 times before the enemy ever arrived. They had not, of course. That was the thing Vothrik could never make himself believe, the thing that fed the growing dread among his soldiers. There was no grand human plan, no master strategist who had foreseen every compact move. There was only Cass Delgado and Master Okonkwo and 30-odd smiths who knew their mountain in their bones and who asked themselves, before each compact move, the simplest possible question: if I wanted to take this forge, what would I try next? And then they made sure it would not work. It was not genius. It was not prophecy. It was the intimate, total knowledge of a home defended by the people who had built it, against invaders who had read a file. But to Vothrek's soldiers, wading through the dark, it felt like being outthought by the mountain itself, and that feeling did more to break the 9th Legion than any avalanche. There was the matter of the prisoners, too. On the 5th day, a Vothrek fire team got turned around in the maintained galleries, a thing that happened more and more as the humans collapsed section after section, and the tunnels became a maze that matched no map, and 4 soldiers found themselves cut off, out of contact, deep in the stone, in a dead-end gallery that the humans had blocked behind them without knowing they were there. They had food and water and power for perhaps 2 days. After that, they would die in the dark slowly, and the compact would never know exactly where. Cass found them on the 6th day. She was moving through a crawlspace above the blocked gallery, checking her charge placements, and she heard them below through a heat vent. The low, exhausted, frightened murmur of soldiers who had stopped being an army and become 4 beings waiting to die in a hole. She lay in the dark above them for a long time, listening, and the fear and the hate rose up in her, because these were the people who had killed Osai and Vance and the 3 at the arch, who had come to take her home, and it would have been the easiest thing in the world to drop the vent's small charge and end them and move on. She did not. She would not have been able to explain why, not then, not for years afterward. It was not mercy exactly. She was too tired and too grieved for mercy. It was something closer to refusal, a refusal to let the invaders make her into the thing they had assumed she was. They had come believing the humans were soft prey to be harvested. They had learned, at terrible cost, that the humans were not soft. But there was a second lesson, and Cass understood in that dark crawlspace that it mattered as much as the first, that the humans were not what the Compact was either. That a people could be immovable in defense of their home and still not become butchers of the helpless. That strength and cruelty were not the same thing, whatever the Compact believed. She went and found Okonkwo, and she told him about the 4 soldiers in the dead-end gallery, and she told him what she wanted to do. And the old man looked at her for a long moment and then nodded slowly, because he had been teaching her to listen for years, and he was not surprised in the end by what she had heard. So on the 6th night, the humans opened the blocked gallery from their side, carefully, with charges set to clear the rubble without bringing down the ceiling, and they left the 4 Vothrek soldiers a way out, and a message scratched in the local trade script on the gallery wall where the soldiers would find it. Go home. Tell them we let you. And then the humans withdrew into the crawlspaces and watched, through the vents, as the 4 soldiers crept out of the dead-end gallery, found the cleared passage, found the message, and understood slowly what had been done to them and why. Those 4 soldiers made it back to the Vothrek lines, and what they carried back with them did more damage to the 9th Legion than any charge Cass ever set. Because a soldier can be told that the enemy is a monster, and he will fight the monster with a clear heart. But a soldier who has been spared by the enemy, who has been let go deliberately by the very people whose comrades he came to kill, with a message telling him to go home and tell the others, that soldier carries a poison back into his own ranks. He carries the knowledge that the humans could have killed him and chose not to, and that they were not afraid to let him carry the story, because the story was itself a weapon. It said, "We are stronger than you, and we are better than you, and we are so certain of both that we will prove it by letting you live." There is no doctrine that answers that. There is no counter to an enemy who defeats you and then spares you as a way of showing you exactly how thoroughly you have already lost. The 4 soldiers told their story, quietly, in the dark of the barges, and it spread through the Legion the way water spreads through cloth. And by the 7th day, there was not a soldier in the 9th who did not know that the humans in the mountain had held 4 of their own in the palm of their hand and let them go. It was after that, Vothrek would later reflect, that the true rot set in, not fear of death, which soldiers can bear, but the far more corrosive fear of being outmatched in every dimension at once, of facing an enemy who was harder than you and also better than you, and who knew it and had proven it, and did not need to gloat because the proof was already walking around inside your own lines telling everyone what had happened. And there was the matter of the message the humans sent up, on the 6th day, that Sekelvan never entered in his log because he could not decide, even years later, what to make of it. It came on an open channel, unencrypted, broadcast from somewhere inside the mountain, in the Compact's own trade tongue, spoken by a young human voice that the Overmaster's analysts identified, too late for it to matter, as the same voice that would later be linked to the Porflor disaster. It was short. It was not a threat, and it was not a plea, and it was not a demand for surrender. It was, of all things, an explanation. "This is Threshold," the voice said. "We know why you came. You came for the forge because you cannot fold the metal yourselves, and you thought you could take it from us because we are few and far from home. We are few, we are far from home, and you still cannot have it. Not because we are strong, we are not strong, there are 31 of us left, and you are thousands. You cannot have it because it is ours, and we made it, and we would rather give it back to the fire than give it to you. That is not courage. We are afraid. Every one of us is afraid every hour in the dark. It is not courage. It is only that there are things a person will not do to stay alive, and giving you our home is one of them. We are telling you this plainly so that you understand it is not going to change. You can spend 1,000 more soldiers and it will not change. You can spend 10,000 and it will not change. We have already decided. We decided the day you came down from the sky. The only question left is how many of your people you are willing to bury in our valley before you believe us. We hope it is not many. We take no joy in it, but we will bury as many as you send. Go home. There is nothing here for you but graves. Sekovan had listened to that message alone in his quarters 4 times, and each time it had settled deeper into him. It was the most dangerous transmission he had ever received, and its danger lay precisely in its calm. Fanatics screamed. The desperate begged. This was neither. This was a 19-year-old Smith explaining, patiently, as if to a slow child, exactly why the thing he had come to do could not be done, and offering him the chance to stop before it cost him everything. And he had not listened, because he was an overmaster of 40 years, and he could not yet make himself believe that the arithmetic was truly a lie. He had ordered the assault on the poor floor the next day, and the humans had proven, in fire, that every word of the message was true. That was the thing that stayed with him in the end, more than the 5,000 dead, more than the burned forge, more than the dread. They had told him. They had told him plainly in his own tongue exactly what they would do and exactly why, and they had asked him to go home, and he had not listened. And so the graves in the valley were not truly the humans doing it all. They were his. The humans had offered him every chance to avoid them. He had chosen the graves. And a commander who has been warned honestly and in plain language and has chosen the graves anyway cannot even hate the enemy for the outcome. He can only carry it. Which Sekovan did for the rest of his life, up to the last lecture he ever gave. The walking weapons platforms came onto the poor floor at dawn, and for a moment, a single held breath of a moment, it looked to Vothrek, watching through his optics from the widened gallery mouth, like victory. The floor was vast and dim and silent. The great presses stood dark and idle along the western wall, 40,000 tons of folded plate machinery gone cold. The crucible cars sat on their rails. The furnaces glowed low and red at the floor's northern end, banked to a sullen minimum, throwing long shadows across the port stone deck. And there was no one there. No defenders. No ambush. Nothing but the machinery of the forge, standing whole and unguarded, exactly as the Overmaster had ordered it taken. Vothrek's platforms fanned out across the floor, their 6-legged bulk moving with fluid caution, sensors sweeping the shadows and finding nothing. Behind them the soldiers poured in, 2,000 of them, fire team after fire team, filling the great space, securing the presses, moving toward the vaults at the floor's southern end where the master patterns waited. It was working. After 7 days of ghosts and buried galleries and soldiers who feared the dark, it was finally simply working. The humans had spent themselves in the tunnels. They had nothing left for the floor. The forge was his. Vothrek allowed himself to believe it for perhaps 90 seconds. Then, in the control gallery high above the northern furnaces, behind a wall of forge glass that the Vothrek optics had read as structural and dismissed, Cass Delgado put her weight on the master pour control, and the forge woke up. The furnaces did not glow low and red anymore. Every heating element the Starforge possessed came to full power in the space of 4 seconds, a thing that was never, ever done, a thing that violated every safety protocol Master Okonkwo had spent 40 years enforcing, a surge that would burn out the elements permanently and gut the forge's ability to ever pour steel again. Cass did it anyway. She had made her peace with it in the long, careful night. If the forge could not be held, it would not be given. And if it took its own death to break the enemy, then the forge would die doing the last and greatest pour of its life. The crucibles, the great precharged crucibles that Okonkwo's crews had spent the night filling to the brim with the deep fold melt, the alloy at its most molten and most terrible, tipped on their gimbals all at once. Cass had not fired the pour sequence 1 crucible at a time, the way steel was poured in the ordinary work. She had fired all of them, every crucible on the floor, simultaneously, and 40,000 degrees of molten Starforge alloy came down onto the poor floor not as a controlled river in a containment channel, but as a flood. The channel gates were open. Cass had opened them in the night, welded them open, so that there could be no closing them, no undoing it. The molten steel did not run down the channel to the ingot molds. It ran out across the floor, across the poured stone deck, in a spreading incandescent tide that filled the great space with a light and a heat that no living thing could stand against. The walking weapons platforms, armored against plasma and coil fire, and the collapse of mountains, had not been built to stand in a rising sea of molten metal. Their legs buckled and fused. Their reactors cooked off one by one in blossoms of white fire that added their own heat to the inferno. And the soldiers, the 2,000 soldiers of the 9th Legion, packed into the great space, driving for the vaults, found the floor beneath them turning to a lake of liquid fire with the only exit, the widened western gallery, behind them across a spreading tide they could not cross. They ran. They ran for the gallery mouth, and most of them did not reach it, and the ones who did reach it found it filling behind them as the flood ran into the low western end of the floor where the gallery opened, so that the last thing many of them saw was the mouth of the tunnel they had come to conquer through, glowing white, welling molten, sealing itself with the very alloy they had crossed the stars to steal. Cass watched it from the control gallery, her hand still on the master control, her face lit orange by the Holocaust below, and she did not look away. She had sent people she loved into the dark to die for this floor. She would not give the enemy the mercy of not being witnessed. She watched the 9th Legion die in the heart of the Starforge, and she felt no triumph, only a vast and hollow grief, and underneath it, cold and certain, the knowledge that it had been necessary, that they had come to take her home and this was the price of the taking, and that she would do it again. Beside her, Master Okonkwo watched too. His face in the furnace light was very old and very sad. "That's the forge then," he said quietly. 40 years gone in 4 seconds. "I'm sorry, Master." "Don't be." He put his hand over hers, over the master control, both of them slick with sweat in the terrible heat. "A forge is not the furnaces, Cass. A forge is the hands and the knowing. The furnaces we can rebuild. The knowing," he nodded down at the incandescent floor, at the vaults beyond it where the master patterns still waited, untouched, unreachable, safe behind their own mote of fire. "The knowing is still ours. You saved the knowing. You gave them the furnaces and you kept the soul. That is the finest pour I have ever seen made on this floor, and I will not have you sorry for it." Overmaster Sekovan lost the poor floor assault and 2,000 soldiers in the span of a single dawn, and when the reports reached the command well of the Ascendant Toll, the silence that followed was the loudest sound the flagship had known in 40 years. He had committed the reserve. He had committed the walking weapons platforms, the irreplaceable heavy assets of the expedition. He had massed 2,000 troops for the killing blow, and the humans had let every one of them walk onto the floor, and then drowned them in the very thing the Compact had come to steal. The forge was not taken. The forge was a lake of cooling alloy with 2,000 of his soldiers entombed inside it forever, a monument in cooling metal to the arrogance that had brought them there. He stood in the command well for a long time and did not speak, and his officers did not dare to speak to him. He was doing arithmetic, and the arithmetic had, at last, become impossible to argue with. He had come with 9,000 ground troops. He had, by the 7th day, something under 4,000 left, and those 4,000 were not the confident professionals who had come down from the sky. They were soldiers who had watched the mountain eat their comrades for a week, and then watched 2,000 of their number drowned in fire in a single morning. They were soldiers who had begun, in the small hours, to speak of the humans not as an enemy but as a phenomenon, as something the universe had put on this world to teach the Compact the limits of its reach. He had lost his heavy assets. He had lost his timeline. And he had lost, most fatally of all, the thing that no report ever measured and no reinforcement could replace. He had lost the belief in the bones of his legion that the humans could be beaten at all. And the humans had lost. What? He made himself do that arithmetic too, honestly, as a commander must. By his best estimate, the human defenders numbered a few dozen. He had killed perhaps 10 of them. 10. He had traded 5,000 soldiers and his heavy assets and the entire strategic purpose of the expedition for 10 farmers, and the forge still was not his, and could not be made his, because the humans had made it perfectly clear that they would burn it to slag before they let it be taken, and had proven that they meant it. This was the moment. Sekelvan would remember it for the rest of his life as the moment the contempt he had carried down from orbit finished dying, and something else finished being born in its place. Not respect. Respect was too small a word. It was closer to what his soldiers had begun to feel in the tunnels, the thing they had called the mountain being alive. It was dread. A cold, clear, permanent dread of a species that would rather drown in fire than kneel. That could take a colony of metalworkers and a box of avalanche charges, and grind an expeditionary legion to ruin in a mudball valley. That did its own arithmetic, and arrived at a number the Compact had no answer for. If this was what one modest colony could do, one colony of 300,000 farmers and smiths, with no fleet and no dreadnought and 2 dying weather platforms, then what? Sekelvan asked himself in the cold blue light. What in the name of every ancestor did the Compact imagine it was going to do about the rest of them? About the human homeworld? About the human worlds that had fleets, that had dreadnoughts, that had not yet been given a reason to bury their mountains and pour their floors? The Compact had come to Threshold to take a prize and teach a lesson. It had instead been taught one. And the lesson was written in 5,000 dead soldiers and a lake of cooling alloy, and it was this, that the humans would not be conquered, because conquest requires that the conquered value their lives above their home, and the humans, when it came to it, did not. Overmaster, Toresk's voice was very quiet. Your orders. Sekelvan looked down at the tactical projection of Threshold, turning slowly beneath his ruined flotilla. The forge glowed on the display, a bright new heat signature where the poor floor had become a lake, cooling now. The humans somewhere in the stone around it, waiting, 34 of them or 20 or 10, however many were left, waiting to see whether the Compact would come again and give them another chance to teach the lesson a second time. He thought about ordering the orbital guns to break the mountain flat. He could do it. He had the firepower. He could turn the whole valley to glass and call it a victory and lie to the assembly about the forge. But he knew the way Cass Delgado knew a bad fold before it happened, that it would not be a victory. It would be a confession. It would be the Compact admitting in fire that it had met a people it could not conquer and could only destroy, and that admission would spread to every world in Compact space faster than any sensor could stop it. The humans of Threshold had already won the only victory that mattered. They had made the Compact afraid. All that remained was whether Sekelvan would compound the defeat by making the fear public. He was, whatever else could be said of him, not a stupid man. Recall the ground element, he said. All of it. Every soldier we have left, bring them up. Toresk stared. Overmaster, we are withdrawing. We are withdrawing. Sekelvan's voice was flat and final. We are leaving this world, Flag Captain, and we are never coming back, and neither is anyone else once the Assembly understands what happened here. Record this in the flotilla log under my name so that it cannot be softened or lost. The colony designated Threshold was assessed as a soft acquisition. The assessment was wrong. The humans are not to be conquered. Any commander who attempts it should be prepared to spend an army and gain a grave. He turned from the projection. Send it, all of it. And get us out of this system before they find a way to pour the sky. They did not believe it at first in the mountain. When the Vothrek ground element began to withdraw, when the soldiers in the maintained galleries stopped advancing and started falling back, when the sensor ghosts in the crawlspaces reported the enemy retreating down the widened western gallery toward the mountain face, Cass would not let herself believe it. She had learned in 7 days that hope was the most dangerous thing in the mountain, more dangerous than the walking guns, because hope made you careless, and careless got you killed. So when Rena came crawling through the ducts with her face alight and gasped out that they were leaving, they're actually leaving. Cass, the tunnels are emptying. Cass made her say it 3 times and then made her prove it, and then, only then, allowed herself to climb up through the heat-scavenging ducts to the high vents on the mountain's shoulder and look out across the valley with her own eyes. The landing barges were rising. She watched them go up on their columns of blue fire, one after another, lifting off the scorched valley floor where they had come down 7 days before to take her home, rising back into the sky that had vomited them onto threshold. She counted them. She counted them twice. 14 barges had landed. Fewer than 14 rose. Some had been destroyed, some abandoned, and the ones that rose heavy and slow. And she understood that they were carrying up the survivors of a legion that had come down whole and was leaving broken. She watched until the last of them dwindled to a point of light and vanished into the high blue, and she watched the flotilla in orbit begin to break station, the great ships that had ruled her sky for 7 days sliding away toward the system's edge, toward the void, toward home. They were leaving. They were actually truly leaving. Cass sat down on the cold stone of the mountain's shoulder, in the thin, high air, and for the first time in 7 days she let the fear go, and what came in behind it was not triumph and was not relief, but a grief so vast and so total that it took her a long time to understand that she was weeping. She wept for Osai, and for Vance, who had carried Osai's body out and then died 3 days later holding the central gallery, and for the 3 at the arch whose names she made herself say aloud one by one into the empty sky. She wept for the 40 who had mustered in the number 3 gallery and the fewer than 30 who were left. She wept for the furnaces she had burned out forever, for the forge that would never pour steel again the way it had, for her father who had died on that floor and would have understood, better than anyone alive, what she had done to it and why. And underneath all of it, threaded through the grief like a fold of clean steel through slag, she wept with the sheer animal relief of a young woman who had expected to die in a mountain, and had somehow, against all the arithmetic, lived. Master Okonkwo climbed up to find her there, as she had known he would. He did not speak for a while. He lowered himself down onto the stone beside her, joints protesting, and he looked out over the scarred valley and the empty sky, and he let her weep, because he knew, as he knew most things, that there are moments when the kindest thing a teacher can do is simply to be present and to say nothing at all. When she was done, when the worst of it had passed and she sat spent and hollow in the thin, cold air, he said, "You know they will tell this story on 100 worlds now. The Compact will try to bury it, and they will fail, because a story like this cannot be buried. It goes into the stone of a people, the way you went into the stone of this mountain. Every colony that ever feared the Compact is going to hear what 34 Smiths did in a mudball valley with a box of avalanche charges and a floor full of molten steel, and every one of them is going to sit up a little straighter." He was quiet a moment. "You did not just save the forge, Cass. You did not just save Threshold. You taught the Compact a thing about our species that they are never going to be able to unlearn. And that lesson is going to keep worlds free that you will never see, and that will never know your name." "I don't want a name," Cass said. Her voice was raw. "I want Osa back. I want Vance back. I want the forge back the way it was. I want them to have never come." "I know. I know you do." He put his heavy arm around her shoulders and she let him, the way she had not let anyone since her father died. "But they did come, and you met them. And you sent them home carrying a fear they will pass to their children's children. That is not nothing, girl. On the days when the grief is bad, and there will be many of them, you hold on to that. It is not nothing." They sat together on the shoulder of the mountain until the light began to fail, the old smith and the young one, and below them in the valley, the great lake of Starforge alloy cooled slowly toward solid, and hardened and became, as all folded steel becomes, harder in the cooling than it had ever been in the fire. The story did spread, exactly as Okonkwo had promised it would. Sekelvan's flotilla log reached the compact assembly, and the assembly did try to bury it, and the assembly did fail. It failed because Sekelvan had written it under his own name, plainly, and had refused every subsequent request to soften or retract it, and because an Overmaster of 40 years' distinguished service does not lie in his own log, and everyone in the compact knew it. It failed because the 4,000 soldiers who came home from Threshold could not be silenced, and would not stop talking, and told anyone who would listen about the mountain that was alive and the floor that became a lake of fire and the humans who would drown in their own steel before they knelt. It failed most of all because it was true, and truth about the humans had a way of moving through compact space like a crack moving through a bad billet, from the flaw outward, all at once, all the way through. Within a year, 3 species that had been quietly considering submission to the compact reconsidered, and began instead to make quiet contact with the human worlds. Within 3 years, the compact assembly formally revised its strategic doctrine regarding humanity, in a classified directive that circulated widely enough to become an open secret across 100 worlds, and the operative sentence of that directive, the sentence that would be quoted in war colleges and cantinas and colony town halls for a generation, was the sentence Sekelvan had written in his log on the 7th day, hardened now into policy. The humans are not to be conquered. Any commander who attempts it should be prepared to spend an army and gain a grave. Sekelvan himself never took another command. He was not disgraced. The assembly understood in the end that he had lost not through incompetence but through the simple misfortune of being the first to learn a lesson the whole compact needed to learn. But he did not want another command. He had stood at the mouth of a mountain and felt the dread of a species uncoil in his chest, and he had come home carrying it, and he found that he could not put it down. He spent his last years lecturing at the compact staff college, and the whole of his lecture, delivered once a year to each new class of would-be conquerors, was the story of Threshold. He would tell it plainly, without excuse, and at the end he would look out at the young officers in their rows and say the same thing every time. You will read the file on a human colony, and it will tell you the population, and the defenses, and the industry, and it will let you calculate that the colony is soft. And the file will be correct about all of it and wrong about the only thing that matters, because the file cannot measure the thing that met us on that world. It cannot count what a human will not surrender. I went down to Threshold to teach them their place in the order of things, and I have spent every year since teaching you ours. We are not the top of the order, we never were. We simply had not yet met the people who would show us the edge of our reach and stand on it and dare us to cross. He would let the silence stretch. They came to conquer once, the men I commanded. They left fearing humanity forever. Learn from us and do not go where we went. That is the whole of my lecture. That is the only thing worth teaching you. Cass Delgado never heard those lectures, and would not have wanted to. She stayed on Threshold. She married eventually, a man from the number 2 annealing line, and she had children, and she watched the Starforge rebuilt. Not the way it had been, but new, better, the burned furnaces replaced and the great lake of alloy cut and quarried and forged into the bones of the new facility, so that the forge that rose on the valley floor was quite literally built from the metal that had drowned an army. The vaults survived. The master patterns survived. The knowing survived, exactly as Okonkwo had said it would, and Cass poured steel on the new floor for another 40 years, and became, in the fullness of time, the master smith who ran the poor floor, the way Okonkwo had before her. She trained apprentices, and when she found one, now and then, who had the gift, who could put a palm flat on a cooling billet and feel the flaw sleeping in the heart of it, she would take that one aside, and she would tell them the thing Okonkwo had told her, the thing that had gotten her through 7 days in the dark and 40 years after. The steel is always talking, she would say. Most people are too loud inside to hear it, and there will come a day, maybe, when something comes for what you love, and everyone around you is doing the arithmetic and the arithmetic says you lose. On that day you do what you do with the steel. You get quiet in the right way. You listen. And you let your hands do what they already know how to do. And then she would smile, the slow, sad, proud smile of a teacher watching a student pick up a tool, and she would say, "We held this mountain once, girl, against an army that came down from the sky certain we were nothing. We were smiths. We were not soldiers. We were better than soldiers because we knew the ground and we knew what we would not give up. They came to conquer us. And they left afraid of us, and they stayed afraid, and they are afraid still, out there in the dark, of what a human will do to keep her home." She would put a cooling billet in the apprentice's hands. "Don't you ever let them forget it. Now listen. Tell me where it's going to break." And the apprentice would close her eyes and get quiet in the right way and listen to the steel.